You know, when we think about what it takes to fly a plane, we usually picture someone mastering all those complex switches, dials, and controls. But what if I told you that the most complicated and unpredictable machine in the cockpit isn't the aircraft at all? It's the human body sitting in the pilot's seat.
So to really get a grip on this, here's our flight plan. First, we'll look at the tough medical checks pilots have to pass just to get started. Then, we'll head up into the hostile sky and see what altitude actually does to the human body. After that, we'll explore the really spooky stuff, when a pilot's own senses can tell them deadly lies. And finally, we'll cover the personal checklist that keeps them safe before they even start the engines.
All right, every pilot's journey begins right here, at the starting line. It's a series of medical hurdles they've got to clear long before they ever leave the ground. So what does it really take to fly a plane? Well, the very first step isn't touching a flight stick. It's seeing a doctor. The Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, has to certify that the person in control of that aircraft isn't a risk to themselves, their passengers, or anyone on the ground. Now, there are different classes of these medical certificates, and the standards scale directly with responsibility. If you're a private pilot, your certificate might last for years. But for an airline transport pilot who's over 40, that certificate is only good for 6 months. It makes sense, right? The more lives you have in your hands, the more often they're going to check on you. The FAA's #1 concern is preventing something called sudden incapacitation. That's why conditions that could cause a pilot to lose control without any warning, we're talking things like epilepsy, psychosis, or severe heart disease, are immediately disqualifying. Now, waivers can sometimes be granted, but the bar is set incredibly high to ensure safety is always the top priority.
Okay, so once a pilot is medically cleared, they enter the hostile sky. And this is the next major battle, learning to survive in an environment the human body was just never designed for.
The biggest bad guy up there is completely invisible, odorless, and silent. It's the lack of oxygen, a condition we call hypoxia. As you climb higher, the air gets thinner, and the pressure that's needed to push oxygen from your lungs into your bloodstream just drops off, effectively starving your brain and your vital organs. But here's the thing, hypoxia isn't just one problem. It can attack the body in 4 different ways. You've got your standard thin air hypoxia at altitude. Then there's hypemic hypoxia, where something like carbon monoxide basically hijacks your blood cells. Stagnant hypoxia is like an internal traffic jam, where blood just isn't flowing, maybe from pulling high G-forces. And finally, with histotoxic hypoxia, your cells are poisoned by something like alcohol and just can't use the oxygen that's right there. This leads us to one of the most sobering realities of flying, the time of useful consciousness. That's the precious tiny window a pilot has to realize they're hypoxic and actually do something about it. At 25,000 feet, you might have a few minutes. But at 35,000 feet, a typical cruising altitude, that window slams shut to less than a minute. And at 45,000 feet, you've got just 9 to 15 seconds. Think about that. That's barely enough time to realize something is wrong, let alone get your oxygen mask on. It is a terrifyingly short window to save yourself and everyone else on that plane. And it's not just about oxygen. The simple act of changing altitude puts immense physical pressure on the body. As you climb, air trapped in your middle ear and sinuses expands. As you descend, it contracts. If your tubes are blocked, maybe from just a common cold, that pressure difference can cause absolutely excruciating pain.
Now we turn to the enemy within, because the most insidious danger isn't always the air outside, but the faulty signals being generated inside a pilot's own mind.
This is called spatial disorientation. See, on the ground, our inner ear, our eyes, and what we feel all work together to give us a solid sense of which way is up. But in the air, without a clear horizon, the forces of flight can trick our inner ear, creating these powerful and totally convincing illusions that can be fatal. The most common illusion is something called the leans. Imagine you're in a slow, gradual turn. So slow your inner ear doesn't even notice. When you finally level the wings, the fluid in your ear canals shifts, and it creates this overwhelming sensation that you are now banking in the opposite direction. Your body screams at you to correct back into the turn, even though your instruments show you're flying perfectly straight and level. Even more lethal is the graveyard spiral. A pilot in a long turn might lose the sensation of turning entirely. Noticing they're losing altitude, they pull back on the controls to climb. But because they're still in a turn, that action only tightens the spiral, causing the plane to lose altitude even faster. Their very instinct to save the aircraft is the exact thing that dooms it.
And you'd think, well, at least you can trust your eyes, right? Not always.
On approach to landing, a runway that's narrower than what you're used to can create the illusion that you're too high, tricking you into flying a dangerously low approach. And get this, an upsloping runway creates the exact same deadly illusion.
This single sentence is the mantra drilled into every single pilot. It is the core principle that saves lives. When your body is screaming that you're turning, but the instruments say you are level, you must have the discipline to believe the gauges, not your gut.
And finally, that brings us to the last line of defense, the final check. This is all about the risks that don't come from the plane or the sky, but from the pilot themselves.
Pilots are trained to run checklists for their airplane, but the most important checklist is the one they run on themselves. It's the I am safe mnemonic. Before every single flight, a pilot has to ask, am I suffering from any illness? Am I taking any medication? Am I under stress? Have I consumed alcohol? Am I suffering from fatigue, or am I emotionally compromised? A yes to any of these could be grounds to stay on the ground.
And these factors have a direct, measurable impact on performance. Fatigue degrades your concentration and totally disrupts the timing of critical tasks. Stress can cause you to get fixated on one small problem, which makes you miss the bigger picture. These aren't just feelings, they are real physiological states that impair the ability to fly safely.
The combination of alcohol and altitude is especially dangerous. The FAA has a strict 8 hours bottle to throttle rule, but the science is even more stark. Because altitude reduces oxygen availability, the effects of alcohol are multiplied. One drink in the air can have the impact of 2 or 3 on the ground, creating that histotoxic hypoxia we talked about, basically poisoning your cell's ability to use what little oxygen is even there.
Now the good news is that this all comes down to training and preparation. Pilots learn to manage these risks. They understand the causes of these illusions, they control their movements, and they make sure they are physically ready for the flight. But above all else, they are trained to rely on their instruments when their own senses fail them.
So when you see a pilot, just remember that their job isn't only about flying a plane. It's about actively managing a fragile biological system in an environment it was never meant to be in, all while battling misleading signals from their own mind.
And in the end, this really highlights a universal truth. That mental and physical discipline required of pilots, that constant self-assessment of stress, fatigue, and fitness is a standard of self-awareness we can all learn from, whether we're flying a plane or just navigating our daily lives. The most important instrument is always the person in control. The real question is yours calibrated for what's ahead?